ranking member of the full committee here. The subcommittee will come to order. This is a markup on HR 3655, HR 3993, and HR 4805. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for the purposes of opening statements. As I indicated before, we will consider 3 bills today, and our subcommittees held legislative hearings on these bills, and I will introduce the manager's amendment on each of these bills. The first bill up for consideration is H.R. 3655, the Bereaved Consumers Bill of Rights Act. I authored the bill, which was introduced on September 25th, 2009. H.R. 3655 directs the FTC to promulgate rules requiring all cemeteries, crematoria, and mausoleum owners to provide clear and conspicuous disclosures and pricing information about their products and services, including costly pre-need contracts, memorials, burial rights, grave liners, and vaults. These owners will also be required to produce and retain existing records pertaining to the location, date, and rights associated with each interment, inurement, or entombment of human remains. H.R. 3655 makes misrepresentations of federal, state, and local requirements and the improper tying of goods and services out to be violations of the FTC Act requiring unfair or deceptive acts, unfair or deceptive acts or practices. H.R. 3655 does not preempt state laws or actions. It will enable states' attorney generals to bring civil actions on behalf of state residents in federal district court for compliance enforcement and for money damages and restitution as deemed appropriate by the court. This is a good bill that establishes federal minimums to protect vulnerable consumers from being taken advantage of, and it levels the playing field between discrete segments of the funeral goods and services industry, which consumers perceive as being a single, quote, one-stop shop in a, quote, marketplace. Accordingly, I respect and urge each one of my colleagues to support the Bereaved Consumers Bill of Rights Act. The second bill that the subcommittee will take up is H.R. 4805, the Formaldehyde Standards and Composite Woods Products Act. As we heard from our hearing last week, this legislation will achieve 2 very important goals: protecting American consumers and protecting American jobs. It would do so by setting a federal standard based on requirements already set by the state of California to limit the amount of formaldehyde that can be emitted from composite wood products. H.R. 4805 will provide a level playing field for America's manufacturers in competing against importers who currently do not have these standards unless they sell in California. Consequently, badly needed manufacturing and other jobs are going overseas, and American consumers and workers and American consumers are less safe. And speaking of protecting Americans, this bill will ensure that there is not a needless repeat of the disaster with the FEMA trailers used after Hurricane Katrina, which made so many people sick, unnecessarily so. And I would like to again commend Representative Matsui for championing the Formaldehyde Standards for Composite Wood Products Act. I respectfully urge my colleagues to support the bill to ensure that we're doing everything we can for both consumers, for businesses, and for the American worker. The third and final bill we will take up today, H.R. 3993, the Calling Card Consumer Protection Act, comes before us in the form of a bipartisan manager's amendment. And I would like to thank Mr. Engel for his leadership and for introducing this critical piece of legislation. The manager's amendment makes a number of technical and substantive changes to the bill. And allow me, if I might, to highlight the most significant changes. The amendment affords the FTC flexibility to develop disclosures that will benefit consumers and allow users of prepaid calling cards to comparison shop. H.R. 3993 will exclude from the definition of, quote, prepaid calling card distributors, end of quote, certain retail merchants and persons who merely engage in the transport or delivery of prepaid calling cards. Further, this outstanding amendment will include a new preemption section that is similar to the language included in the bill as it passed the House in the 110th Congress. Under the amendment, state laws that contain requirements regarding disclosure on calling cards or packaging would be preempted. In addition to the provisions currently in the bill that require the FCC to consult with the FCC, the amendment adds to that should the FCC initiate a rulemaking on disclosures for prepaid calling card, it must coordinate with the FTC. Finally, this amendment requires the FTC, in consultation with the FCC, to conduct a study of the prepaid wireless industry. I respectfully urge my colleagues to support the bipartisan manager's amendment that is being offered today on H.R. 3993. And that said, I yield back the balance of my time, and I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee for the purposes of an opening statement, my friend from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rush, thank you very much. We look forward to working with you today as we mark up these three bills. The first, H.R. 3993, the Calling Card Consumer Protection Act, brings uniform disclosure requirements to address fraud and deception in the prepaid calling card market. Much of the fraud is through the marketing of country-specific cards sold primarily to immigrants. This bill will provide meaningful disclosure requirements, including the value, minutes, fees, and rates and penalties for prepaid cards. I'm also pleased that the manager's amendment does address some of the concerns we heard regarding, for example, point-of-sale liability, as well as recognizes the need for a single uniform federal disclosure requirement. As far as the H.R. 3655, the Bereaved Consumers' Rights Act, I want to commend the chairman for moving forward on this legislation. As we know, the FTC has had jurisdiction over funeral homes for some time, and now cemeteries, You even have Walmart and other companies selling caskets, and we've had some rather disturbing examples of fraud and deception in the Chicago area and Atlanta area, in which people, in their most vulnerable time of trying to take care of the last arrangements for a loved one, have been taken advantage of. I've spoken to the funeral directors in my district, and all of them support this legislation and believe it is a step in the right direction. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I would like to express concerns that I spoke of last week regarding the formaldehyde legislation introduced by Ms. Matsui, H.R. 4805. One of the biggest concerns I have about it is that it simply refers to the state of California as setting the standard, the actual law, and it does not direct the scientists at EPA to investigate from a scientific standpoint the specifics of this legislation. I personally do not think it is good to simply refer to another state law, the California state law, on a subject and let that become federal law. The California regulation, by the way, has not even been fully phased in yet, and I would also point out that when this legislation refers to California, it's not even a statute, it's a state regulation. So I don't believe that we can really get a complete picture of the effectiveness of the California regulation. I'm also concerned about the lack of federal preemption under this bill. It seems to me that when you're relying on a state of California for a standard, and then other states may come in with different rules and regulations relating to this bill, and there's no federal preemption, that we're going to have a rather hodgepodge of guidance out there for manufacturers and others. And for those reasons, I intend to offer two simple amendments today at the markup. The first will be addressing the federal preemption issue. We'll establish one set of rules for manufacturers instead of potentially burdening them with 50 different state laws. And then the second amendment would simply specifically write in the standard of the California regulation, but not refer to it as the California regulation. While I have concerns about this regulation in general, I believe that we should not be simply referencing it in federal legislation. But I look forward to working with you and other committee members as we bring this legislation to the full committee, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's markup. H.R. 4805, Formaldehyde Standards for Composite Wood Products Act, would help industry achieve consistent standards of compliance, create jobs, protect public health, boost consumer confidence, and reduce harmful emissions. I've partnered with Congressman Ehlers to introduce this legislation, which would establish national standards for formaldehyde in domestic and imported composite wood products. It would apply the rule recently adopted by the California Air Resources Board in collaboration with industry, regulatory authorities, and public interest groups to lower limits for formaldehyde emissions in most composite wood products. In so doing, the bill would direct the EPA to accept a standard that is already being practiced by our domestic industries. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this bipartisan, bicameral legislation, which is publicly endorsed by industry, environmentalists, labor, and healthcare advocates. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member from the subcommittee, from the full committee, rather, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for working with Ranking Member Whitfield on regular order to move these bills at subcommittee before they go to full committee. We have 3 bills before us today. One bill we're 100% with you on, the Calling Card Consumer Protection Act. You've worked in a bipartisan fashion, and we're continuing to do so, and we think that's a good piece of legislation. One bill, you have identified a real problem, the issue of the problems in the cemetery that your constituents have had such a horrible experience with. I want to help, and I think the minority wants to help on that issue. I'm not sure if federal law is the right way to do it. You've certainly identified something that needs to be corrected. We have at least I have a problem with the proposed solution. But having said that, we understand that it's a problem. The last one, the Formaldehyde Standards for Composite Wood Products Act. With all due respect to my gentle friend from California, I think that's a terrible bill. I think we ought to ask the EPA to do their job, and if there's a problem with these furniture products and other things, existing law can handle it. It's certainly something that needs to be looked at, but I don't think, with all due respect, even though California is the largest state in terms of population, I don't think they have a corner on the market for how to address some of these problems. And so on that one, H.R. 4805, I'll have a number of amendments to it, and quite frankly, I would hope that we could defer markup and continue to work to see if there wasn't a better approach than the approach that's before us. With that, Mr. Chairman, I've got a complete statement, and I'll put that in the record, but in the interest of time, I'll yield back.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the markup on these three bills subcommittee previously held hearings on. These are all important bills to protect consumers. I'm glad we're taking action to move these bills to the full committee. Formaldehyde is a known carcinogen, but it's still in use today in unsafe levels. The Formaldehyde Standards for Composite Wood Products Act, H.R. 4805, is an important bill that protects consumers from unknowingly being exposed to this chemical, often at vulnerable times. The most publicized case involving FEMA trailers used for Hurricane Katrina, relief that contained unsafe levels of formaldehyde, and was an issue Texas officials had to be mindful of in the Hurricane Ike recovery effort by requiring certification that trailers provided met the state's standards on formaldehyde. Mr. Chairman, I was a state legislator in the 70s and 80s, and we had the same problem with our manufactured housing and our mobile home community, so it's not a new issue. The bill would require EPA to issue regulations on formaldehyde emissions from hardwood, plywood, medium-density fiberboard, and particle board that will be in commerce in the United States, and requires HUD to update its regulations reflecting the new EPA standard. The Calling Card Consumer Protection Act, H.R. 3993, will also greatly benefit consumers, particularly groups that are targeted towards such as military and immigrants. Excuse me, calling cards can provide a good value to consumers, particularly for international calls. However, these cards are largely unregulated, and a number of bad actors exist that charge astronomical connection fees and other charges on unexpecting consumers. H.R. 3993 would require clear disclosure of all relevant and applicable information to consumers. These disclosures would include contact information for the provider, the number of minutes available, and the dollar value of the card. Lastly, bad actors exist in every industry, but the thought that someone would mislead or take advantage of a family that has just lost a loved one is especially dishonest and troubling. The last thing someone wants to do following a death in the family is be pressured into purchasing something unnecessary or overpriced services, nor do they want to have to shop around to make sure they're not being scammed into drastically overpaying for a service. A number of states have laws regulating practice related to the funeral services. Others have not or do not have updated laws on the books, and because of that, we need to set a floor for the rights of individuals planning a funeral and burial. Mr. Chairman, I support your legislation, the Bereaved Consumers Bill of Rights Act, to develop and issue rules prohibiting unfair and deceptive practices for sellers of funeral and burial goods and services. The legislation would require the Federal Trade Commission, which currently regulates funeral homes under the Funeral Industry Practices Trade Regulation Act, rule to expand the rule to cover other entities involved in providing funeral, burial goods, services such as crematories, cemeteries, caskets, retailers, headstone, and marker retailers. These are all good pieces of legislation, Mr. Chairman, and I support them. Look forward to our markup, and I yield back my time.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're marking up 3 bills that all have the goal of enhancing consumer protection. The Calling Card Consumer Protection Act will help prevent fraud and abuse in the rapidly growing prepaid card industry. With Americans spending billions of dollars on these cards, it's worthwhile to ensure that providers disclose the full terms of the cards and are not deceptive to consumers. I'm pleased that both sides have worked together on excluding certain merchants and businesses who are only engaged in the transport or delivery of these cards. The Bereaved Consumers Protection Act seeks to protect consumers who have lost a loved one. Unfortunately, we have seen instances where some funeral homes and cemeteries have engaged in despicable acts, thereby violating the trust held in them that our loved ones' remains are being treated with dignity and respect. As we learned during our hearings on this bill, states have responded quickly to these incidents and have enacted strong regulations and laws to protect consumers. During our hearing, we discussed whether federal legislation was needed, and I hope we revisit that topic today so we can decide the best plan for this legislation. And lastly, we will mark up the Formaldehyde Standards and Composite Wood Products Act. Formaldehyde has created serious problems in South Louisiana since Hurricane Katrina that we've dealt with throughout parts of my district and the surrounding New Orleans area. And I commend Ms. Matsui for bringing attention to this issue and for bringing up this bill. I, along with some of my colleagues, have concerns about some of the provisions in this bill, and I hope we can address those today to ensure that consumers are better protected from unsafe formaldehyde. Mr. Chairman, it is important that we continue to report legislation out of our subcommittee that enhances consumer protection without creating unintended consequences and burdensome regulations that don't solve the real problems. I look forward to discussing the merits of these 3 bills and addressing the unintended consequences in the legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the vice chairman of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schukowsky, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup, and I commend the authors of all 3 bills for their great work. I am pleased to be a co-sponsor of your bill, Mr. Chairman, that would address the horrific situation that we saw last year at Burr Oak Cemetery in our own state of Illinois. The Calling Card Consumer Protection Act is also a critically important bill. 2 months ago, I heard from many of my Haitian constituents who were using calling cards to try to use their loved ones in Haiti after the earthquake. Because of the high fees placed on the cards and the lack of clarity about fees and terms, they were going through dozens of cards without ever having a call connected. Even in the best of times, terms like 3-minute rounding and a service fee of 28% will be added to the total charges on every call are unfair. And when those additional fees aren't even fully disclosed to the consumers, we have a serious problem. Mr. Engel's bill would also address that problem, and I encourage all of my colleagues to support it. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding today's markup, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now. The chair now. Hold on. The chair now calls up H.R. 3655, the Bereaved Consumers Bill of Rights Act. The clerk will report the title of the measure.
H.R. 3655, to direct the Federal Trade Commission to establish rules to prohibit unfair or deceptive acts or practices related to the provision of funeral services.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. The subcommittee now will, and I wanted to announce this, will now stand in recess until 1 p.m. when it will reconvene and continue consideration of H.R. 3655. This is because of a conflict in various members' schedules. So the subcommittee now will stand in recess again and reconvene at 1 p.m.